2 p.m. on the dot, so we will get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Firm Manager webinar, Bill More, Work Less, Making the Case for Law Practice Management, featuring David Houlihan from Blue Hill Research. My name is Kelly Barker, and I will be your moderator for today's session. The format for today's webinar is a 60-minute presentation, including Q&A. All of our attendees will be in listen-only mode. Any questions that you have will be answered at the end of the webinar. For those attendees seeking CLE credit, our professional education team is in the process of seeking approval for this program. You will receive an email within the next 2 weeks from our CLE team with your CLE paperwork. On the paperwork, you will be required to give 2 participation codes. The first code is 0PY99. Again, that first code is 0PY99. At the end of the webinar, I will repeat the first code along with the second code. So before we get started with the presentation portion of the webinar, I'd like to introduce our speaker, David Houlihan. David is a Massachusetts attorney and principal analyst researching the use of technology to support legal practice and business management. He is an experienced advisor in legal and technology fields with a unique understanding of complex information environments and legal business needs. So with that, I'll hand things over to David.
Great. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, whatever is appropriate where you are. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. My name is David Houlihan. I'm a principal analyst for a firm called Blue Hill Research. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means and who I am beyond what Kelly said, but really what we're here to talk about today is a research project and study that I did over the last year, understanding the business case, investment, and impact of law practice management solutions for small firm environments and sort of to be able to draw out what that means. So as Kelly said, I'm a practicing attorney. The majority of my experience is in boutique law firm and small law department environments, primarily focused on commercial and IP law. I've also spent about 9 years of my life as a business analyst studying the use of technology by organizations and with all that entails and means. The last sort of 2 years, I've been able to put both of those worlds together at Blue Hill, and what I do sort of day in, day out is try to study and understand how technology is used to support the legal sort of world, both as legal as a functional need within enterprises, and then also really as an industry vertical, looking at all the various forms of technology that are available to support lawyers sort of in practice and in management of their businesses. To sort of give a little bit more context to that, Blue Hill doesn't solely focus on sort of the legal world. What we are is a technology analyst firm. What we do is research the technology investment decision-making process across any number of sort of functional and business areas. Our analysts look at any number of sort of pieces of the world to understand how technology supports business. What we don't do so much is understand the operational and functional needs. There's a lot of people who do that, and certainly we keep an eye on it. What our focus really is on is the business case and need for technology to really understand how businesses take advantage of technology or shouldn't take advantage of technology in the context of the investment, right? So if I think of sort of the research process as a series of questions, I just laid it out here. Really the core question being, how does this affect our business? But to go into a little bit more detail, how to identify a need, sort of a pain point or an opportunity for a solution. How do you turn that into a business case? And then how do you sort of use that business case to look at your priorities, look at the options that are available on the market, and sort of identify a solution that fits that. We're primarily going to be talking about the first 2 questions today. We might touch on the third a little bit, but generally speaking, that's what we do, and the way that we do that is really through in-depth interviews, day in, day out, with technology buyers in different places and organizations, based on sort of the focus of my research. Really, primarily, who I'm talking about, particularly is relevant to the topic today, is managing partners or CIOs of law firms, and to understand their various viewpoints and experiences so that we can extract out estimates of what the business impact is, and sort of lessons learned and observations that we can turn into recommendations for other folks going through the same process. So that's more or less our goal today. One, I just want to share the results of our research that we conducted around practice management solutions and investments, and then use those sort of observations from the research to help sort of provide a framework that you can use around determining whether or not your organization will benefit from LPM, whether or not there's what the business case should look like, how to build it, how to evaluate it, and then how to determine the expected return on investment. Excuse me. I think that's important here in both what we're trying to accomplish and how we're going to sort of talk through this research. I didn't want to share sort of academically. I really want to walk through our thought process and how we did the research and trace the experiences that we saw that were effective for firms that had made investments so that we can help sort of reinforce how that evaluation process works. So sort of the last housekeeping piece just about the research, I already mentioned the objective, right? To sort of understand the business case and decision-making process around LPM, understand the impact, particularly for the small firm environment. You know, we're talking, you know, roughly, I think the cutoff that's usually used and that we use is less than 50 attorneys. You can see at the bottom here. As that sort of broke down to sort of smaller groups with some key differences between them, relatively consistently, you know, from sole practitioners, 2 to 5 attorneys, you know, up to 30 to 50 attorneys, and so that we can understand the differences between each. And though we'll really sort of try to talk generally about the trends here about them. 45 law firms in total that we spoke with in every case. As I said, a managing partner. If it's a sole practitioner, obviously it was easy to identify, or some member of the sort of senior partnership that was involved in the firm. Generally, the person that had been tasked with understanding and sort of supporting the technology pieces. Key questions that we asked in these interviews, though this is hardly inclusive, right? What the challenges, opportunities related to practice management were, what the business case looked like, how they went about understanding the solutions that were available, and sort of what the impact is afterwards. The one piece that I didn't put here, and really that's just our mistake, is that the breakdown of firms using practice management versus those not using practice management, it's about 2 to 1, so about 2/3 of the firms had a solution in place, 1/3 did not, and that sort of let us do some interesting comparisons that we'll get into as we go forward. Really to start though, quickly, I want to talk about sort of what is practice management, set some definitions for ourselves. I'm going to start very generally and then kind of work down into what I believe is sort of gives us a practical understanding. I'm going to sort of go through 3 major themes, right? Practice management is a solution that supports law firms in the management of their business, the management of matter information, and then as a collaboration platform. If I put sort of my IT wonk hat on and sort of create a sort of general solution description, I've sort of put that up here. I'm not going to read the definition, but what I'd say that sort of key points to take away are that what we're talking about is a solution system, platform, you know, whatever you want to call it, that centralizes firm data, both business and matter data, and centralizes the management processes, automates processes, and then makes all that sort of remotely available and consolidates it into one environment. Sort of giving that, we call it a single source of truth here. It's a bit of a cliche, but I think it gives a sort of good sense. We're talking about the sort of one universal record of everything for the firm, right? And in one piece we should touch on as well, I didn't use it for the definition, but practically speaking for everything that we go through here, another major component that we're going to be talking about is the availability of a cloud solution. So if we talk about cloud versus on-premises solutions, on-premises generally refers to a solution that is installed sort of on-site on your network, on your server, etc., as compared to a cloud solution, which is sort of served remotely via a third party, and maybe the solution provider, and maybe someone else. But that distinction is going to play relevant here, but it's not really a core piece of law practice management, so we don't want to necessarily put that into our definition, but you're going to start seeing it emerge more and more as we talk, right? So going kind of from that generalized sort of basis, I wanted to do more to see how we could tie this solution to the capabilities that exist in sort of the real world use for law firms, and then I again related it to these three factors: business management, matter management, collaboration. What we start to do is draw out what I would say the common core functionality of practice management typically is. I think this is generally familiar to folks. It's important to say, though, that no one solution necessarily does all of this. There's any number of capabilities that aren't tracked here. These represent, though, what Blue Hill finds tends to be most often provided by practice management solution providers and most often deployed within organizations, with it as a practice management solution, right? So from the business perspective, we're talking about client and contract management. Some folks may be familiar with this as CRM, really sort of managing the various sort of folks that are generating your business and sort of their information as it relates to the firm. A time tracking capability, even though that we see a rise in alternative fee agreements, that I think the hourly billable is still key for a lot of folks, and that's going to, just having a solution to sort of automate the administrative pieces related to taking in that information, automated billing, right, producing bills, transmitting bills without having sort of human interaction, accounts for reconciliation. What we're talking about here is really trust accounting, sort of the management of IOLTA accounts and checking all the boxes that are involved there. From the matter management side, generally what we're talking about is scheduling, sort of a solution to automatically identify the various dates and deadlines that are involved in sort of a case, building sort of in sophistication from that, project and case management, sort of understanding the status and the deliverables in all of our open cases and projects for our clients. Process management really being how we understand how we're moving through the workflow associated with those cases. Again, sort of varying degrees of sophistication there, but from open to close, essentially. And then document management, how we essentially sort of relate all the documents that are involved sort of to those processes, to those clients, to those matters, right? And then sort of on the collaboration piece, here's where we get a little bit more into the cloud piece. It's not limited to it, but certainly how we heard it discussed among participants. And really what we're talking about is remote storage, remote access, and remote collaboration, so that our firm's information and really all the functionality that we talked about above and sort of access to data and documents, etc., becomes available to us wherever we are sort of in practice, right? So that sort of we understand that increasingly sort of work and personal life becomes less and less distinct, and the ability to access files, on the way to court, at the beach, whatever, becomes a piece that's important, and then also bring together sort of distributed stakeholders so that they're working on one document, right? Sort of all that's just the functional stuff. I thought that's important to tie together as we move forward to talk about how we understand and how our participants understood what a need for practice management looked like. So we're going to really start with the basic value proposition from that sort of operational perspective, mostly as discussed by vendors as what we've observed in that conversation, move through that to understanding the relationship to those sort of business processes and operational processes that are involved, and then talk about the investment drivers that we heard from our respondents, and then from there we're really going to move more deeply into some of the research that sort of came out, right? The observations that we were able to make. So just quickly, the basic value propositions, and again, this isn't exhaustive, but more or less what we hear from various vendors in the market really relate to, we can put them in three different buckets, right? LPM helps reduce manual processes. It centralizes information. It helps with reduction of duplication and error. It's that one source of truth thing. Eliminating version control, making sure that all of our information, that sort of our billing data and our sort of matter management and our client management data are all drawing from one place, and then we can see that through line between that whole conversation. Then also sort of the reduction of that on-premises management of systems and data. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail, but what does it mean to have a server or not have a server, to be able to sort of externalize that cost and the management pieces. Again, this is really relates to the cloud conversation that's going on in relationship to these solutions, and how we can turn a lot of these costs of a solution in-house, be it someone's time, be it just equipment cost, into a subscription cost to support everything. So to sort of, again, make it more and more concentrated, I sort of prepared this eye chart. I'm not going to walk through everything. And you can sort of scan or not scan as we look through. I think what's important is that what we're trying to do is narrow down and understand. If I look at all those various sort of functionality pieces that we talked about before, this slide is really meant to just sort of capture how these processes were being performed as reported to us by firms without practice management compared to those that had it, right? And what I'd say, as you look through, right, there's some common themes that should jump right out. On our left side, we see that everything's manual. We're seeing sort of this diversity of solutions that are used, email, spreadsheets, paper files, etc. There's no sort of one source of information. Standalone solutions for billing, etc. It's just what all this ends up being is sort of extra time, extra opportunity for errors, etc. On the right-hand side, where we see the impact from LPM is right, automation, removing that human effort that's involved. Centralized management, making sure that there's one source so that we reduce, errors, increase accessibility, etc., and on and on. The thing that's important here too, though, is that the right side isn't a full sort of elimination of the left. We still see some standalone solutions. We still see paper files. I don't think anyone will ever get rid of Excel. What's important isn't that we're not trying to present a black and white distinction. It's sort of a shift that the organization can make, and the sort of business conversation we need to have is what is the value of that shift? What does it mean in terms of the impact for the organization, for the business and the other concerns that are involved? So this slide, again, I apologize, it's a little bit difficult to follow, again, sort of on purpose. What I wanted to do was give a sort of large scope of the pieces that are involved in tracing the sort of business value propositions provided by the vendors in terms of the operational impact of the solutions, to the drivers, the objectives that we heard in our conversations with study participants that told us this is what's valuable about LPM, right? So rather than try to trace the through lines, we'll sort of go through them one by one. Just to draw your attention to the left-hand side, again, what we're talking about is automation, centralization, sort of that reduction of IT. On the right-hand side, sort of a similar but different conversation, right? What we're really talking about is reducing attorney time dedicated to sort of management of case information, business needs, billing, scheduling, all that kind of stuff. Increasing the efficiency of support staff in doing sort of that same work, right? It's really about the person that's impacted versus the net impact is the same as the reduction of that sort of administrative time. Then sort of improving attorney effectiveness. And then finally reducing the cost and risk of IT and files, again, related primarily to cloud, but not entirely, although we'll talk about that as we get to it. If we look at attorney time savings, this tends to be one of the most significant ones, relates to that automation centralization theme. The things that we tended to hear sort of on the right hand of the slide here that fell into this bucket, firms were concerned about billable time being lost to administrative work, to time attorneys spent trying to find a file that was related, a document that was related, version control, all that kind of information retrieval stuff. I have it listed here as excess billable time charged to clients, sort of seen as the risk, billing for something you didn't work through, and not really having the transparency there. There's obviously the flip side as well when you sort of worry about that and fail to bill for time that you worked because either you forgot about it or you weren't concerned. All the stuff that happens when billing happens sort of by hand at the end of the month because someone hasn't really at a deep level tracked everything, right? And then sort of ability to access files remotely, right? How to have that sort of time value to be able to work where you want or not work. That in particular relates, we found, to sort of the work-life balance driver. So if we think about previously sort of the business impacts, we also heard, particularly amongst the very small firms, small 2 to 3 attorney firms, a real concern with letting the attorney sort of get out of the office and do some work wherever they want and sort of balance out their time involvement, not necessarily increase billable hours, for example. And this relates to this sort of remote accessibility. We had one gentleman who was a sole practitioner who really what he wanted was to be able to go to his daughter's track meets and be able to watch her throw the javelin. And what he was able to do, the reason he put LPM in place, was just to get that time to be able to go and work in his car throughout most of the meet, go watch, cheer for the javelin throw, and then go back to work, right? To have that flexibility sort of across his lifestyle. From the staff side, again, sort of the same factors: automation, centralization. The impact, again, is very similar as far as time. The time we're spending sort of maintaining, retrieving files, supporting attorneys, dealing with all those information concerns, all the business administration concerns. What's important here, and we'll talk about this a bit more as we go, that the relationship is really measurable in terms of the cost of human resources for the firm, so sort of the cost of labor. That's a little bit misleading because really what we're talking about is increasing the capacity of staff support, right? What we're not saying is that folks implement a practice management solution and lay off a whole bunch of support staff. What ends up happening is they become more effective in taking on more complex matters, how they support the attorneys, what they're able to do. What we're going to do is measure that in terms of that labor value because that's sort of the most convenient factor to use. But the drivers are much more diverse and the opportunities are much more diverse. Finally, sort of the attorney effectiveness and risk pieces. These are sort of a catch-all factor. It, again, comes from sort of administration, centralization. We're talking about two kind of subsegments here. One is really client-focused. I call it attorney effectiveness, but it might be just client satisfaction. The notion is that the more information that's sort of easily available to the attorney in a rapid period of time, the more responsive they're able to be to the clients, the more on top of a matter they appear to be to the client, whether or not that's true, and sort of the more points of interaction you're able to have, which obviously impacts that relationship. From the professional risk perspective, what we heard is I don't think unsurprising to anyone. We have folks concerned with scheduling errors that lost them, had them miss trial dates, lost files. Conflict checks is a major concern as well. Folks doing it in, say, Outlook or Excel sheets who really didn't have the sort of due diligence involved, or were doing it from memory and didn't have anything that they could really show to prove that a deep level of understanding of their conflicts was done, or they were spending too much time doing it. And also, obviously, the IOLTA and client trust management to make sure all that is correct. Those are all time sinks that are available, available to attorneys that can be automated, but there's also, through the formalization and centralization, that removal of errors, the sort of risk of exposure is reduced as well, and we heard that. Last piece, really that IT and paper piece. This is maybe a little silly, but there's a real cost to organizations in just the physical files that are in the firms, right? The printing cost, the paper cost, the cost of third-party file storage, just the office real estate required for the files. One of the organizations we spoke with was, an 8-attorney firm. They were a rural firm, and they sat and looked at essentially the comparative cost rate. They had run out of space in the office, and the managing partner had two proposals on his desk, one for the cost of building a barn to put all of their files in, and one for practice management. Practice management was cheaper, so they selected that, right? It's really sort of at that level. Those costs are real. And oftentimes we heard related IT costs, right? The servers on site, the cost of backup, the risk of what happens if we lose that server, what the cost of maintenance is, even if we don't have an IT folks in-house. What's the attorney or the staff member that has to spend their time making sure the server's online, or what's the cost of sort of consulting provider that we use? Those are all real as well, and sort of end up putting folks towards, again, this is in particular a cloud solution. So what we want to do here is go from these sort of various factors as they sort of existed as sort of mellifluous things for the organization, and start to trace out how that became business cases. And I have sort of 3 steps and 3 sets of dynamics that we're trying to monitor to understand that and that we walk through, right? One is that's important is what we're going to call the difference between an investment objective and an investment need, and sort of the dynamic between the two. Two is understanding how an objective translates into a need. It's a matter of sort of transparency of information, oftentimes, to be able to make the comparison. And then really, as if to answer that question, what we're just calling sort of 3 tasks that are involved: identifying, measurement, compare. We'll talk about this in more detail. Typically, what we're talking about is costs, though. Identifying costs of the firm, measuring what they are, and being able to compare that to sort of the cost of a solution. We'll go into more detail. To start, though, I wanted to go back to sort of this 4 set of goals, sort of look across them. One observation we should make is that be they folks with a practice management solution or firms without one, every single firm that we spoke with said that they saw value in practice management. I don't think that that's necessarily globally representative, but it was true for every case that we spoke to in the course of this study, right? They saw one of these pieces of value, and I would say almost to a soul as well, every single firm reported all of these factors to some degree or another. There's some sort of variation in the priority and the weight given to them. For instance, the smaller firms tended to focus more on reducing attorney time, whereas larger firms, in that 30 and 50 range, much more focused on sort of the support aspects, the support costs, and that shouldn't be too surprising. That's just, again, it's a matter of where that work is being performed and sort of where that cost, so the sort of pain point lives. Important to point out that while all these concerns were listed sort of in all places, these top two to the left, really the ones that were the bold underlying concerns. These were the most important things told to us time and again, both by folks with LPM, without LPM, right? Really the core value, even for the larger firms, the most important thing, sort of the top 2, reduce attorney time spent in sort of non-billable hours, for lack of a better term, and then also improving attorney effectiveness, right, and preventing all those risks that are involved. Those were the most important things, and I think that's great, and I think that's important as we think about it. The story that tells is really about increasing billable hours, increasing attorney efficiency, and increasing client satisfaction, which is another way to just say growth for a firm, right? Organic growth for a firm. The more we focus on these areas, we're going to bill more, people are going to work less, we're all going to make more money, we're all going to be happier, our clients are going to be happier. That's sort of the best utilization of our assets, right? Be it me, the sole practitioner who gets to go on vacation more, be it just be sort of across my attorneys in my firm, that they're all generating more revenue for the firm. That's just good stuff to have. The thing about that, though, is that so if those 2 factors are reported across the board as the top drivers, the interesting thing is that every time we looked at moving from those being as sort of the most important things to the firm to what caused the firm to put a practice management solution in, 8 times out of 10, 9 times out of 10, the answer was something related to IT or the file system. And I'll tell you specifically, it was the server died. We ran out of room on the server and we had to buy a new one. And, as I said, we ran out of space in the files, so we had to build a barn. We had to look at the cost of an outside provider, and we had a real visible cost to the organization that we had to deal with right away, right? All of our files were gone, or all of our files were going to be gone. There was a real sort of what we'd call an impending event that sort of forced investment. Despite the fact that the firm may have for some time been saying to itself, there are all these other business benefits, this great sort of increasing of revenue, increasing of client satisfaction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those never sort of translated into action. And so the natural question that we asked then was, well, why that is, and I think if I sort of summarize it as a basic observation, It's not particularly profound, but I think it's important and I think it's true. Drivers, right, objectives do not create action without a clear business need. And to sort of give a little bit more context to what I mean by that, I'm going to restate it as such. If you don't know what it cost you, you're going to keep doing what works. In other words, what sort of you've always done until you can't, right? Until that impending event comes. This is what we saw across these situations. And that's not necessarily a fact of that there wasn't value before, etc. It's just that there was nothing to make that transition tangible, right? So our job in trying to understand whether or not practice management will offer a net benefit to the firm, sort of in isolation from those crisis moments, is really about trying to make the need that exists in the business that we may or may not understand more transparent. Make it something that we can measurable so we understand the ongoing costs are that we don't necessarily recognize, right? And so I've turned that into 3 steps. They're sort of deceptively simple. 1, identify your objectives. Where's your pain? Where's your opportunity, etc. 2, measure those objectives and measure those needs as existing costs to the organization. And I think it's important to understand this in the context of cost, particularly in relationship to sort of all that sort of revenue growth, et cetera, upside. Not to say that we shouldn't think about that and shouldn't measure it. We need to put that in the context of costs of the organization and try to estimate what's actually being cost now. And we'll talk a little bit more about what this means by not being able to obtain that revenue, as opposed to upside, because upside sort of is always infinite. We can always imagine that we can make more money. We need to try to estimate this as something concrete as it relates to the business. And then the real final task is to compare those costs to the cost of investment, right, and understand whether or not investment makes sense, right, which is the greater net cost of the business. So let's to sort of depack all of that and sort of put it in a little bit more context. I'm going to start again at the goals that we were talking about, right? To the left, sort of our 2 most important, but recognize that all these play a role in the process, but we want to sort of walk out and turn these from business objectives to understand what they look like as measurable needs. So I have sort of extracted from our 4 3 business buckets that related to what we heard from organizations. 1, inefficiency in practice and administration of the law firm. That's both among attorneys and support staff. What I'd call sort of wasted effort that isn't needed. Time lost, right? 2, professional and IT risk. What we've done is just lump our 2 risk categories together. And then our IT storage and maintenance costs, right? There are 3 sort of measurable business areas that we can sort of contextualize these objectives as. What that becomes then is we pull that apart into sort of measurable factors. Interestingly enough, we break back out the sort of inefficiency piece into the context for the attorney and context of the staff. In this sort of context, because we can measure it in different ways, right? For the attorney, what we're talking about is total hours worked versus billable hours, right? How much of the time that your attorney spends or that you spend doing your work is billable? How much does that get paid for? How does that relate to your lifestyle, right? What are these sort of ratios that we can understand to understand the value of what we do, and as compared to what it costs us? It's really the same set of questions for staff, but the way we're going to measure that is in sort of the number of support staff, particularly in ratio to the number of attorneys, and then the cost, again, because we can measure the value of labor and because we can use that as a basis for comparison to understand what the value of those ratios are and how it relates to how sort of our capacity in supporting the firm. 3rd, risk. We're actually not going to talk too much about this, but I did want to highlight, because it is always present, there's a whole science and sort of methodology about managing, identifying, and understanding risk, and so we just laid out the 3 factors that are relevant there, right? You want to know the likelihood of your risks, the frequency with which events that sort of pose those risks occur, and then what's the value at risk. Are we talking about a minor fine, or are we talking about a loss of license, what's the total business value. And I really just want to highlight those to keep in mind as we think about those IT risks. What does it mean if a server dies? What's sort of how can we estimate that down the road? What are the professional liability risks, etc. Very difficult to measure in practicality, but again, something we want to keep our eye on. And then the IT piece, right? What's the cost of storage and equipment, etc. What's the cost of labor associated with maintaining that? Those are factors that we can create a concrete understanding of our costs too. What we then want to do, right, is just compare and sort of set a basic framework for doing that, what the costs of the firm are after investment, whatever we've sort of identified as our objectives, whatever we think we should measure, compared to what those costs were before investment. If the cost after investment plus the cost of a solution, right, the cost of a practice management solution is greater than your costs before investment, then you don't have a business case and you don't have a need for practice management. It's simple as that. There may be other things that make the case. There may be that upside. There may be value. But if you can't find those cost components, it's not there, right? There's nothing that you can really hang your head on. And vice versa, if your costs before investment are less or more than your cost of your solution and the cost after investment, then you have ongoing costs to the organization and you have a business need. So all I've done here is just lay out those factors as they relate to sort of the framework, right? We're comparing our hours worked, our billable hours, staff overhead, likelihood, frequency of risk, IT and storage costs. We want to know sort of before and after investment what those are so we can make our comparison. We want to think about the cost of solution. There's a couple of factors that are involved there. The sort of license cost, whatever it costs to acquire the technology, the implementation cost. That's the time, also the resource use that's needed to sort of set it up. And then obviously the maintenance cost, the ongoing cost of making sure that everything works. There might be a license involved in that as well, depending on the solution. What's actually nice about practice management solutions, for the sake of this, is that, particularly in the cloud piece, and this is part of that value of cloud solutions, is that there's generally a pretty basic subscription model. It's a sort of set price per user that sort of incorporates a lot of this license cost, maintenance cost, implementation cost, sort of consolidates and simplifies that evaluation. Okay, so I want to use the remaining time to really dive into our findings. One, having built from how the organizations we spoke to identified their objectives, how those objectives turned into business cases to understand what the actual impact they experienced from practice management was, and then go through, using our framework, talk through 2 models for how Blue Hill tried to estimate some dollar figures associated with that impact based on a number of sort of industry estimates and value that we kind of came across sort of aggregating various studies. And then we'll just sort of conclude with some sort of key takeaways and points that we shared. So I want to start again with sort of what we're going to look at. Again, I'm going to focus on attorney efficiency and support staff efficiency in terms of the models that we talk about today. That's because those are, one, sort of easier to develop and articulate than the risk management piece, and 2, I think often harder for organizations and less transparent to track. And this data piece is really where the rubber meets the road, and folks know or don't know what those costs are, and they discover them when those needs are there. So I really want to, if we're talking about creating more sort of transparency and understanding of the risks, we're going to focus on the ongoing business needs, right? Attorney time, what that means for revenue, and then staff time, what that means for capacity to support and labor cost. Great. So this slide summarizes the impact that we were able to get from our participants in sort of these 2 areas to understand the value that they realized. I'm just going to walk through it quickly. On the attorney time side, right on the left side, we found participants reported, this is per attorney, a decrease in non-billable time, again per attorney, that fell between 4 and 8 hours a month for the firm. The sort of concentration among that fell all over the place, so we didn't want to pull out a medium. What we want to identify was a range of impact so that we can sort of give a sense of what a conservative estimate looks like and what an optimistic estimate looks like, realistically based on the experience of the participants. And then two, how that converted to billable time. Again, we're providing a range, right? What we found is a 20 to 100% of that time saved, be it 4 to 8 hours, turned into billable hours. That's harder to track as a one-to-one. It actually depends a lot on the business priorities of the firm, right? It's a firm that wants to increase sort of work-life balance. They tended to follow, obviously, closer to that 20%. Those more focused on increasing revenue, growing the business, being more profitable, et cetera, tended to find ways to increase that decrease in non-billable time to new billable time, right? And so finding that balance and that relationship is really a matter of firm planning and priority. But what we want to do is identify those two sets of factors as what I call the matrix that's available to work with. Excuse me. On the staffing side, what was interesting is that we found the ratio of attorneys to staff among firms with practice management solutions was 2.8 attorneys per staff member. We don't have it here, but the ratio of attorneys to staff for firms without practice management was 2 attorneys to every 1 staff member. So that's a 40% difference in supporting employees. And again, what's important is that what we're not saying is that firms put in practice management and reduce support staff by 40%. We didn't find anyone reducing staff after putting a solution in place. Really what it's about is increasing the capacity and the availability of support staff to contribute value to the firm. There's always, I think, especially in smaller firms, a lot more that can be done. And we're finding that the firms with practice management are able to do a lot more, provide more support to a greater number of attorneys with a fewer amount of support staff, right? So the capacity is higher. If I want to plug these numbers back into our framework, right, we have sort of 4 and 8 fewer billable hours, 20 to 100% conversion billable hours, 40% fewer employees, right? You can look at your own firm, use those estimates to figure out what those costs would be for you to do that greater variance, sir. Do we then turn from there and look at what that net cost of the solution might be? What Blue Hill did was reviewed, again, what's nice about practice management, particularly for this sector, is that the solutions all tend to publish their pricing models and tend to work on a consistent pricing model. It's a per user per month. There's some variation, but we were able to take those sort of values, aggregate them, and create our estimated average, which is $45 per user per month. So that's an annual cost per user of $540 per year. So I have to apologize right now because more or less the remaining slides that we're going to look at are going to be spreadsheets. So what I'm going to try to do is walk through this. I think this is important to understand how we can estimate the business, the real tangible business impact for the firm based on what we were able to look at. So to start out, we'll just walk through this, and what we did was look at first, again, what those costs of solutions are. We're going to start, I should say, we have sort of 2 models here that we'll present quickly. One sort of the attorney time and revenue way of looking at it, and then we'll look at it from the staff perspective as well. These can combine together in a variety of ways. What's important right now is to just try to look at different ways that we can estimate the value and look through the different lenses of the impact that the solution might make for the organization, with the I being what the objective is, what you feel the need is for your firm. This gives more of a framework for looking in that perspective, right? So we begin with the cost of practice management, $45 a month, $540 a year per attorney. We look at the reported time savings, right? We put in here. Again, we have a range, so rather than pick a median point, we've sort of given ourselves a conservative estimate, an optimistic estimate, and sort of a middle ground, right? 4, 6, 8 hours per month. That becomes 48 hours, 72 hours, and 96 hours per year. That doesn't seem like a lot. I think often, especially, believe the average number of hours worked per associate per year, for example, is roughly 2,000 hours, and you know, that greater or lesser than their sort of billing quota. But you know, in that context, a 48 hours, 72 hours, 96 hours, it doesn't seem like a lot. It's a couple of hours a week that you gain, you know, sort of back into your life. But what we want to do to really try to draw out what the value of that time is use our conversion to revenue to see what's available. So for that, in sort of the study that we did, we built out the sort of conversion rates at a number of different segments, you know, from the 20% to 100% estimates that were reported. For just the purposes of today's conversation, we're just going to look at a 50% conversion, sort of as our cautiously optimistic rate. And then it's a matter of simple multiplication. What we use is a Blue Hill aggregate estimate of the value of a billable hour at $233.70. That's an estimate based on a number of studies of firms outside the AmLaw 200, right, which we thought was relevant here. Obviously, your own practice, your own location, areas that you're focused on, that's going to vary quite a bit. But it gives us an estimate that we can work with. So again, simple multiplication. We take the number of billable hours gained, the 50% conversion rate, we cut them in half, do a multiplication by the hours, right? So we have between roughly 5.5 thousand and roughly 11,000 gained in revenue a year. Again, that's per attorney. The last piece we want to understand, right, again, that doesn't seem like a lot necessarily, that sort of in sort of raw dollar figures, but to compare that to the cost of the solution to get that gain, right, which is $540 a year, we see that it pretty much almost all of the revenue that we increase we keep, and so that means that the return on investment, right, that's sort of just a calculation of benefit minus cost divided by cost sort of lets us know at what rate what we've gained is greater than sort of what we've lost in the investment, right? We have fairly high figures, 900% to roughly 2,000%, depending on how conservative or optimistic that we are. And I'll say that from what's interesting about this is it's significantly higher than what Blue Hill typically finds in sort of larger enterprise investments, tend to fall to 600 and 800% ROI. So in terms of sort of that overage and to look at the cost and the risk associated with the investment practice management, there's really a lot of room to work with there, and it's pretty impressive figures. Quickly to just run through the support stats side, again, we start again with the cost of the solution. We want to look at that ratio and understand what that 40% impact means in terms of the value of labor. For here, we're using an estimate based on, the median salary of one legal support staff. This is based on a sort of consolidation of research by Robert Half, which obviously is a legal support services provider. They publish a number of studies on sort of the national averages of costs of folks in various roles with various levels of experience. It's roughly $60,000 for just a legal support person. You pull all that together. So that's what we want to look at today, right? And understand that difference here because it's simpler and meaningful to pull out. We've looked at a number of different sizes of firms to understand the difference. And again, you know, the impact in terms of people involved obviously scales up with the organization. As you go under 5 attorneys, often this doesn't really make sense because just the alignment is wonky, right? You don't have less than one person unless you have a consultant come in, etc. The needs change and are different. It usually takes about 5 attorneys before this becomes meaningful. And then what we've done from there is just kind of try to estimate what those cost impacts are. It's sort of saved everyone the math. The impact on salary costs are, you know, run between $40,000 and $400,000 a year. Compare that to the cost of solution. It's interesting here, obviously. We have a sort of consistent ROI across the board, right? We understand that that's that impact of 40% compared to the value, the cost of the solution also scales to the organization. So it stays about 1,000%. Again, from what we see, that's pretty good for a solution for investment. I'll present that not, again, to say that that's what it'll be for your organization, but This is really the process that you want to walk through to understand and estimate what the potential upside impact is, and plug in sort of the factors that relate to your organization, what the cost, of the solutions that you're considering look like, what your billable rates are, what your sort of support staff, all that salary pieces come together. Plug it into a similar analysis and try to understand what it looks like the ROI will be for you and whether or not it makes sense. To that end, quickly, I'll just say, the sort of key questions, if we summarize, that we want to talk about here really are about, start with what processes contribute the greatest pain, right? Where does it sort of hurt? That becomes a place to understand, right? Are these processes that can be impacted by LPM? If they're not, maybe your biggest pain is sort of in the coffee maker, and you should focus resources behind that. It's about doing that functional alignment, understand if where you find that you're struggling, where your needs are, really align to functional pieces that LPM can support. Translate those objectives once you've identified them to measurements, right? And I've just listed out the most basic ones we can talk about here, right? Hours worked, billable hours, staff overhead, again, as a way to value the labor, risk, and IT and storage costs. And then begin to understand what the estimated benefits are using similar frameworks to what we discussed before, and compare that to what you believe the cost of the solution will be for your organization based on the pricing rate of the solution that you're looking at, based on sort of the size of the implementation that's needed. And walking through that, I start to give you a really good sense of whether or not the solution is going to give you that impact, bearing in mind that what we saw as sort of observed among our research is 48 hours reduction in non-billable time per month. Among attorneys, 20 to 100% of that time converted into billable time by the attorneys, and 40% fewer support staff, which is a value range that we put at the bottom here. I know that we're coming up to the end, and that's more or less all that we had to present. I know that we want to turn it over and reserve a little bit of time for questions. So, Kelly, why don't I turn it to you for that?
Yep, thanks, David. Fantastic presentation, really great stuff. So we are going to open the webinar up for Q&A, so please submit your questions now via the webinar control panel. All right, at this time it looks like, David, you answered all of the attendees' questions.
Well, wonderful. Who can ask for more?
Exactly. We'll give them a few more minutes here. It looks like there's a few questions regarding the CLE codes and if they'll be able to receive the presentation after the webinar. And I will repeat the codes after the Q&A. And yes, you will receive the CLE slides in the presentation. All right, so I guess we will officially close the webinar. Just a few things before we part ways. First and foremost, I just wanted to thank David for his expert advice today, and to all of our attendees for taking time out of your busy day to join us. All attendees, like I said, will receive an email within a week with a link to a recording of today's webinar as well as the slides from the presentation. Again, for those attendees seeking CLE credit, please watch for an email within the next 2 weeks from our CLE team. You'll need to fill the paperwork out that they send you with the 2 participation codes. Once again, the first code is 0PY99, and the second code is I6SJ9. Again, those codes are 0PY99 and I6SJ9. So that does officially conclude our webinar, and just thank you all for your time today.